Hi, welcome everyone. I think we'll go ahead and get started so that we can stay on time. Thank you so much for joining us. We are excited to be able to present this information to you today. My name is Gwinnell Engelskirchen. I'm with the University of California Sustainable Agriculture Research and Education Program. And I'm coming to you today from the city of Davis, which occupies land that has been home to the Patwin people for thousands of years. And today's webinar on elderberry and food safety is made possible through a grant from the USDA National Institute of Food and Agriculture Food Safety Outreach Program. And my collaborators on the project are joining me on this webinar today. I'm also grateful to Caitlin Sutherland with the UC Agriculture and Natural Resources Program Support Unit for providing technical support. Before we get started, just a couple technical details. Participants will be muted, so you won't be able to use your microphone. However, we encourage you to type your questions into the Q&A message window, which you can access on the Zoom navigation bar. We'll do our best to respond to your questions in the live feed, and we have time at the end for Q&A as well. If you have comments or resources that you'd like to share with all of the attendees, feel free to drop them in the chat. Today's webinar also includes live automated captions. If you do not wish to see these, you can switch them off in the Zoom navigation bar by selecting Hide Subtitles. And if you have any technical problems during the webinar, please message us in the chat and our tech support will be happy to assist you. Or you can send an email to anrprogramsupport@ucanr.edu. And if you haven't done so already, please feel free to introduce yourself in the chat with your name, organization, and the tribal land that you're on. You can learn more about tribal lands by going to native-land.ca. And it's my pleasure to welcome today's webinar speakers, both Dr. Erin DiCaprio and Dr. Thais Ramos are with the UC Davis Department of Food Science and Technology. Gary Moore joins us from Oceanside Jams, preserving native berries and unique flavors. And Jeff Higley is one of the owners of Oshala Farm, a regenerative herb farm in Southern Oregon's Applegate Valley. And we'll be hearing each of them introduce themselves and talk about their work during the webinar. So why are we talking about elderberry? Just briefly, elderberry is a deciduous perennial shrub native to North America that produces both berries and flowers with a wide range of culinary and medicinal uses. If you joined our webinar last week, you heard an indigenous perspective on the importance of elderberry in the landscape, specific to California. The subspecies Cerulean, which grows widely in California, is well adapted to the growing conditions and provides habitat for birds and pollinators. There are other subspecies of elderberry, but the information today on food safety practices is applicable across the different subspecies. And so we hope that regardless of where you're joining us from across the country, that you'll find some information that's applicable. So this webinar is the second in a two-part series. During the first webinar, we were talking about best practices for minimizing foodborne risks. We talked about harvesting, washing, destemming, and gave an overview of California's cottage food law. If you're interested in these topics, there'll be a recording available so you can go back and watch it. And this is a snapshot of what we're planning to cover today. We'll be talking about best practices for drying, freezing, and processing of elderberry. We're also going to give an overview of both federal and California processing regulations. We'll touch on what is a third-party audit and why you might consider it, and we'll review some product labeling requirements. So with that, it's my pleasure to hand it over to Dr. Erin DiCaprio.
Thanks, Gwinnell. Welcome, everyone. Thanks for joining us today. So I have the pleasure of talking about kind of the less exciting aspects of working with elderberries, bringing new products to market. And that's all of the associated regulatory hurdles that one has to navigate to be able to sell food into commerce. So today I'll give kind of a snapshot about some of the federal and California food processing regulations that may or may not impact you depending on your business model and the kinds of products you're producing. As Gwinnell mentioned, in our last webinar series, we talked about cottage food laws with particular focus on the cottage food law in California. So if you're interested in learning more about that particular mechanism for making and selling food products, we encourage you to check out that recording. So I just kind of wanted to start out giving you the federal regulatory landscape when it comes to food safety regulations. And so in the United States, there are two federal regulatory agencies that really hold the majority of responsibility when it comes to food safety. So the USDA, the United States Department of Agriculture's Food Safety Inspection Service, or FSIS, in conjunction with the US Food and Drug Administration, have the authority to enforce the majority of food regulations in the US. And they also enforce these food safety regulations to some extent on imported foods as well. So the USDA, the Food Safety Inspection Service, they have jurisdiction over meat, poultry, and amenable species. So most of our, meat-like products, pork, goose, other products fall under USDA's jurisdiction. But outside of the meat and poultry products, basically every other type of food product is regulated by FDA. So that includes things like produce, seafood, juice, and many other types of processed foods. I will also just mention here that the FDA also has the regulatory jurisdiction for nutritional supplements. So if you're, thinking about maybe getting into the supplement space, FDA oversees the safety of those products as well, but they have a very different set of regulations and minimum criteria you have to meet compared to foods. Foods are generally more stringent when it comes to regulatory oversight. Beyond the federal regulations, there are also state and local food safety regulations that apply to food processors. This is just a snapshot of kind of how that plays out in California. Different states have slightly different structures. The local health departments may be less or more involved depending on the state that you're in. But in California, we have our local environmental health departments that oversee implementation of food safety practices in our cottage food operations, restaurants, farmers markets, as well as retail food establishments like grocery stores. The state Department of Public Health, Food and Drug Branch is the entity that oversees processed food registrations here in California. Any food processor outside of a cottage food operation, restaurant, retail food establishment does need a processed food registration or PFR to manufacture foods here in California. The state also oversees our cannery licensing program. It's not likely that program would apply to many elderberry processors, but this cannery license is required for individuals that are canning low acid vegetables, meats, that type of thing. In California, because we are such a large state, our California Department of Public Health, Food and Drug Branch, as well as the California Department of Food and Ag, actually enforce and do inspections related to the federal regulations in California. So it's unlikely that you would have someone from FDA in your processed food facility or on your farm here in California. Those inspections are all going to be done by our state agents. So I just want to introduce the Food Safety Modernization Act, or FSMA. So this is a federal food safety regulation that applies to a majority of the food that is produced or imported into the United States. And this has really been the largest overhaul to federal food safety regulations in over 70 years. And it's hyper-focused on preventing foodborne illness. So under this overarching FSMA regulation, the FDA established 7 major rules to help implement FSMA, both here domestically and internationally. So these are those 7 foundational rules, and I'll just highlight 2 of them here because I think they're probably the most relevant for this audience. So the first rule highlighted here, the current good manufacturing practices and hazard analysis and risk-based preventive controls for human food. It's quite a mouthful. It's, in short form called the Preventive Controls Rule or Preventive Controls for Human Food Rule. And this is the rule under FSMA that applies to processed foods. So any kind of food manufacturing, food warehousing is all going to fall under this particular rule. The other rule I just want to highlight here is the standards for growing, harvesting, packing, and holding of produce for human consumption. And this is the first ever federally mandated food safety regulation that applies to on-farm produce production. So I just wanted to point these 2 out to the group, and I'll kind of walk us through if either one of these 2 regulations might apply to your particular operation. So the produce safety rule, this is going to apply to farms that grow, pack, harvest, or hold fresh produce. And there are exemptions to this rule, depending on the types of commodities someone is growing, whether or not that produce is going to be further processed, and also the size of the business. So there are exemptions if you're a small farm from this particular rule. The preventive controls for human food rule applies to any facility that manufactures, processes, packs, or holds food. It applies to foods manufactured in the United States as well as in other countries. And like the produce safety rule, there are some modified requirements to this rule based on the size of the business. And so I bring up both of these today because there are certain instances where you may be able to do some level of processing, like drying, under the produce safety rule if you are a grower. So there are some certain activities that can happen on a farm under the produce safety rule and kind of exempt those particular growers that are doing this processing from the preventive controls rule. So I want to just talk about the produce safety rule briefly here in terms of the type of processing that's allowed to be conducted on a farm. So if a farm is, doing any kind of processing beyond this, then they may be eligible to be what's called a farm mix type facility, which I'll talk about here in a minute, or they may be covered by that preventive controls rule I just mentioned. So one of the first things that you can do in terms of processing on a farm is drying to create a distinct commodity without any additional processing. So the example they give in the regulation is drying a grape to get a raisin. So if you are drying elderberries, you may be able to do that as a farm and not have to go beyond the produce safety rule requirements in terms of your regulatory oversight. But aside from drying an intact piece of fruit, perhaps a flower, you really can't do any kind of other processing. There's no cutting, slicing, no jams, jellies. So I just want to make sure everyone is aware of that. So if you are a grower that is drying elderberries, for example, these are kind of the basic requirements that you need to be in compliance right with this particular regulation. There is a required training course, the Produce Safety Alliance grower training course that you have to take as a grower covered by this particular rule. You need to develop some version of an on-farm food safety plan that encompasses all the records that are going to be generating, showing that you're in compliance with different portions of this rule. So there's a lot of record keeping required with all of these regulations, unfortunately. And in California, our farms are going to be inspected by the CDFA's Produce Safety Program. So you won't have an FDA inspector on your farm. So the next thing I just briefly touch on here, because we did talk about it last time, is the cottage food law. And so there are some options for producing low-risk processed foods under the California cottage food law. Other states have cottage food laws as well. You would just want to make sure that you're looking at your specific state's law in terms of what kind of foods you can make, the sales maximums, and that type of thing. But in California, if you are interested in making jams, jellies, doing any kind of drying, in your home kitchen, there are other types of foods as well. This may be an option, and I try and encourage people, if you're just kind of putting your toes in the water when it comes to starting a processed food business, if your food is able to be manufactured in your home under this cottage food law, that's really the most cost-effective way to start out in the food processing business. There's also an exemption to these federal regulations for retail food establishments. So if you produce your food in a facility that's classified as a retail food establishment, so if it's a grocery store or a restaurant, that does exempt you from the preventive controls rule. So this rule does not apply to retail food establishments. So if you have a business where you're already classified as one of these retail food establishments, and then you're able to do some food processing in that facility and sell direct to consumers, and you're exempt from these federal regulations as long as more than 50% of the food that you're selling is going directly to individuals and not to other businesses. So there is this caveat that you're selling direct to consumers more than 50% of the food that you're making. There's also this option called a farm mixed site facility that I think could be really helpful for some in the elderberry space. So if you're a grower and you're doing some level of food processing, there's also this farm mixed type facility definition that gives you a partial exemption from the preventive controls rule. If you're making a very specific set of foods that are on the approved list for farm mixed type facilities. So you can see here, drying, freezing, cutting fruits with a pH of less than 4.2 is allowed in a farm mixed type facility. And so we talked about last week, the Western blue elderberry has a pH below that level. If you're working with other subspecies, you would want to verify that the pH is below 4.2 in your berries. Generally, for Western blues, you'd be able to do the drying, freezing as a farm mixed type facility. You can also, in these farm mixed type facilities, make jams, jellies, preserves from fruits with a pH below 4.6. So again, relevant to those interested in elderberry jams, jellies, and preserves. You still have to jump through a few hoops if you are one of these farm mixed type facilities register with FDA, comply with current good manufacturing practices, comply with local and state food safety laws, but you don't have to conduct this hazard analysis or implement preventive controls, which is really the heavy lift if you're a fully covered facility under the preventive controls for human food rule. So there are some other exemptions based on specific food types. Relevant for elderberry manufacturers, dietary supplements are exempt from this particular rule. Basically, for dietary supplements, you have to follow labeling requirements, basic good manufacturing practices, but you don't have to go through this entire process of conducting a hazard analysis and implementing preventive controls. So in terms of state and local regulations, I just want to focus in here on the processed food registration that is required for food processing facilities in California, outside of those that are cottage food operations or retail food establishments. And so there's really no exclusion for this processed food registration based on a business's size. There is a fee for registering as a processed food facility. There are specific requirements for the building itself, the equipment that's in one of these facilities. And you can find a lot of that information on the California Department of Health Food and Drug Branch's website, which we will refer you to on our resource list. But I just wanted to give you a little snapshot of the timeline of how long it can actually take to obtain your processed food registration here in California. And this is assuming that you're kind of doing everything beforehand to make sure this is a streamlined process. So, typically it's going to take over 120 days to get your processed food registration here in California. I try and encourage people, maybe before trying to do this on your own, work with a commercial kitchen or a co-packer. That's a much easier option. That's where you're going into another facility that already has these registrations, paying for the time spent in that facility, but the individuals running those establishments have already gone through this process for you. So it's a much easier lift than trying to branch out and start it on your own. For organic processors, I'll also point out there is a separate application to get an organic processed food registration as well. So if there's a scenario where you are going to be covered by this preventive controls for human food, this federal regulation, there is, depending on the size of your business, you could potentially be eligible for this qualified facility exemption that will reduce the burden of being covered by this regulation. But if you are fully covered, there's a required training for this regulation. You're going to have to conduct a hazard analysis for your product in your facility, develop a food safety plan with specific controls for any hazards you identify. You're going to have to register with FDA, and you will be subject to inspection by the state here in California. So if you are one of these qualified facilities, and here is the eligibility for that exemption. If you're a very small business, if you have less than $1 million in annual sales, you're a qualified facility, you're exempt from that hazard analysis and implementation of the food safety plan, which again is the most labor intensive portion of the regulation. If you are a qualified facility, you still have to comply with good manufacturing practices. That's a must. And there's a special form you have to submit to FDA, proving to them that you meet this criteria. So if you're a fully covered facility under the preventive controls for human food rule, you have to deal with everything that's listed here on this slide, conduct your hazard analysis, implement controls, monitor those controls, verify those controls are being implemented, develop a recall plan. So there's a whole lot that goes into developing this food safety plan that's required if you're a fully covered facility under the preventive controls for human food rule. And then I just want to end here briefly touching on third-party audits. I get a lot of questions about third-party audits for food processors. So these third-party audits They are not related necessarily to federal food safety regulations, although all of them are aligned with within the federal regulations. But these third-party audits, these are conducted by external companies or agencies that will do a food safety audit of your facility. They are not required under food safety regulations. You don't have to do these third-party audits under FDA regulations, but they are often required by your buyers. So you might have Whole Foods coming and saying, we need a third-party audit. So I just want that to be clear, that these are often things that buyers are asking of processors. It's not a regulatory compliance issue. So there are many different certification schemes. Some are listed here. So Whole Foods may say you need an SQF audit. So there's many different companies out there that will do SQF audits. So just be aware, you may hear some of these acronyms thrown around. There are different certification schemes for third-party audits, and then there are also many different companies out there that do each kind of these certifications. So with that, I'll close it out, and we'll transition into something that I think is a little bit more interesting than regulations, although these are really critical if you're starting a food business.
Oh, yeah.
Thank you so much, Erin. And yeah, I think that's just a terrific overview. We know it's a lot of information, so the recording will be available, the slides will be available. So if people feel like they want to go back through those flow charts and figure out exactly how they apply to you or your operation, you'll be able to do that. But yeah, as Erin said, you know, we also like to sort of ground this conversation in the people that are actually doing the work, and have those voices as well. So with that, I'm excited to hand it over to you, Gary, and hear a bit about Oceanside Jams and your products and how you make what you make.
Okay.
Thank you.
Okay, can you hear me?
Yeah, you
Okay.
sound great.
Okay, great. My name is Gary Moore. I'm a Yurok tribal member, and my wife is Wiyot, and we produce on Wiyot country. We get our license through them. The big thing that we have to have is a food handler's certificate. And other than that, we operate like Canada inside of California. So there's certain sovereignty issues. There's all kinds of exemptions. First of all, we don't do the dollar volume. First of all, everything's 100% cooked. So there's canning regulations that we have that we look at. It tells you the size of the burner and everything that's involved that way. We're not a farmer. We harvest berries wild, at least 8 of them we do wild. The rest of them we track, we buy from farmers, and everything's processed, so everything's canned. The 50% rule depends on how much wholesale we do. We try to keep that in that length. But there's also another requirement that wasn't mentioned, was a 275 mile radius. And you know, we ship all over. I mean, it's been in Europe and Germany. It's been all over the place. People ship our product. So I don't know how we really track that aspect of 50% directly to our consumer. But elderberry is like one of 31 flavors that we do. So we do a lot of unique flavors. My wife has a food acidification program. We have our food tested pH-wise and process-wise and stuff like that. And it's a lot of fun. We steam juice, so that's where we process the elderberries. So there's like a 9-step process for elderberries. You know, harvest, you destem, you clean, and blah, blah, blah. We harvest and we steam juice and we collect. And then with that collection, we either freeze it or we make jelly. So that's the least we have to handle something. Like if we just do, I think it just takes about 15 cups of juice for a batch, yields about 240 ounces. I keep production sheets and I know everything that the times and temperatures, and when my wife added too much pectin on it, I know that too. And it happens by accident, but when you have documentation, you can go back and say, oh, this is what happened and this is the results and stuff like that. So, and there's basically small batches and things like that. So we just started picking salmon berries this last week. So that's the first berry of the season, and the last berry of the season is huckleberry. So from here on out, it's Roadrunner speed. Yeah. So, do you have any specific questions on? Actually, I was talking to a friend that is going to probably grow elderberries for us. So we may do some farming things there, some regulations that. But there's a lot of exemptions, like I said, dollar volume, being cooked, location of process. I mean, if you wanted to rent a kitchen, you can certainly, they have a lot of incubators around that would rent you space on a monthly basis or something like that. Lots of information about growing elderberries, different varieties. Yeah, so any other questions?
That's great, Gary. I think that's a really terrific overview. And we're going to hold all the questions until the end.
Okay. Okay.
But folks might have questions for you and they can put them in the Q&A.
All right.
We can sort of have that conversation going in the message box simultaneously. But thank you so much for giving us that snapshot of your operation.
Very welcome. And I'm glad to help anybody start a business. I went through I was a cottage industry person from the Yurok tribe. My wife went through CIMC to the business. So she had a hobby. I came along and added credit cards and graphics and marketing, and we grew it to a business. So
yeah.
And how you ship to every state.
All those things to it. Yeah.
Yeah.
Well, great. Well, with that, we're going to bring Thais Ramos into the conversation, and she's going to talk a little bit about some of the specific practices around drying and freezing and preserving. So thanks, Gary, and I'll hand it off to you, Thais.
Let me share my screen. Can you see my screen? Yeah?
Yes, looks good.
Okay, good. So thank you everyone who was able to join us today. Today we are going to cover general food safety best practice for processing, but emphasizing freezing and drying processes. So the topics we are going to cover today include types of food spoilage and an overview of freezing and drying as preservation methods. So I just wanted to start talking about food spoilage. What is a food spoilage? So spoilage is really a judgment of when food has deteriorated to an unacceptable level. So this is often influenced by culture or by preference, and the basis for judgment might be on appearance, odor, or also taste. So here's just a quick overview of the different types of spoilage. There are two basic types of spoilage: non-microbial spoilage and microbial spoilage. The physical spoilage of food can be due to loss of water, an example of like staling of bread or directed damage to the food. The chemical spoilage might be due to chemical reactions. One example is when you slice your apple and then that brown coloring is caused by an enzyme, so chemical reactions. And microbial spoilage is the most significant type of spoilage, and it's caused by microorganisms such as molds, yeasts, and bacteria. And so the spoilage affects the shelf life of the food product. So this slide here lists the general categories of microorganisms important to food. So they can be categorized as either foodborne contributors to foodborne illness, food spoilage, or food enhancement. So today we are going to cover two topics of food preservation methods, freezing and drying. So I would like to emphasize that when we preserve or process food, our goal is to prevent, reduce, or control foodborne illness or spoilage. So when we process the food, we can control some conditions where you can discourage unwanted microorganisms, or if desired, encourage the growth of others, such as in fermented foods. So here, there are some factors affecting microbial growth of microbes, such as the source of nutrients, acidity or pH, the temperature at which food is processed or stored, the time that the food is exposed to different temperatures, availability of oxygen, and the water activity. So the water activity, I want to emphasize here, that is not the same as moisture content. So water activity is the amount of free water in a product available for microorganisms to use for their own metabolism. So this water activity can be reduced by removing water or adding solutes such as salt or sugar. So the water will bind to these compounds and will not be available for use by microbes. So we have different types of food preservation methods. As you can see here, we have food preservation methods that inhibit the growth of microorganisms, and also we have methods that will inactivate these microbes. So today, the overview that we are going to cover will be for freezing and drying, and they are methods that will prevent the growth of microorganisms. So they will inhibit, and they will enhance. They will preserve the food, but at the same time, they will enhance the safety of the food as well. So freezing is a quick and convenient method of food preservation that will extend the shelf life of fruits and vegetables. So when you use cold temperatures, such as freezing temperatures, the temperature will slow the growth of microorganisms, the action of enzymes, and also slow the physical and chemical change that cause foods to deteriorate. So the freezing technique that prevents the growth of microorganisms, both spoilage and pathogenic, but it does not destroy them. So as I mentioned in the beginning, it will prevent and inhibit the growth of these microbes. And freezing is not considered a microbial step. So some pathogenic organisms, they are able to survive the freezing process. So it is really important to follow food safety best practice during production, during harvesting, and during post-harvesting, as I mentioned during our first webinar last week, to prevent microbial contamination. So it's also important to always keep the equipment for freezing clean and sanitized. So frozen fruits and vegetables, they have been associated with foodborne outbreaks in the past. The contamination has been caused by pathogenic bacteria, viruses, and parasites. As I mentioned before, freezing is not considered a kill step. What does it mean? So frozen berries, in this case here, often do not go to pre-treatment such as blanching prior to freezing. So if the berries are contaminated in the field during harvesting or during post-harvesting operations, may still harbor these pathogens after thawing. So this kill step, so frozen berries, frozen vegetables, they often have no kill step between harvesting and consumption that would eliminate these pathogens present. So again, it's crucial, to follow food safety practice during harvesting, production, and post-harvesting, and make sure that your freezing equipment are properly cleaned and sanitized. So there's a lot of overlaps for best practice for freezing that also applies for best practice for drying, such as how to minimize hazards associated with raw elderberries and also during processing activities. But since we don't have much time, I won't touch on this again when in a minute when I'm talking about drying activities. So how to minimize hazards associated with raw elderberries. So if you are growing your own elderberries used for freezing, it's important to minimize risks of microbial contamination during production, as I mentioned. So it's important to follow food safety best practice during production and harvesting. If you are sourcing elderberries from a grower, it's important that that grower is following food safety practice during harvesting and production. And most local, state, and federal regulations, they have some level of supply verification that is required. And if you are fully covered by the Food Safety Modernization Act, preventive controls for human food, then it's required that we implement the supply chain preventive controls where applicable. And if you have a supply chain preventive controls, then you have to have supply verification plan written down and also set of verification procedures that will be undertaken. So fresh elderberries, they may become contaminated during processing activities. So it's important to start the processing activities with a clean operation. So what are environmental pathogens? So it means that a pathogen is capable of surviving and also persisting in the processing environment and may result in foodborne illness. So what can you do to minimize these hazards? So it is important to implement sanitation practice because if the equipment is not properly clean and sanitized, and the equipment has poor sanitary design, you can have a problem with microbial contamination. And the non-environmental pathogens are Listeria monocytogenes and Salmonella. Salmonella is the most common concern for dry environments and Listeria for wet environments. So how you can minimize hazards associated with the process for freezing, and also you apply for the process for drying. So it is important to consider equipment with sanitary design to prevent product contamination. Why? So food contact surface, food contact material can serve as a growth niche, which are areas where you cannot effectively clean and sanitize. So it is important to establish a cleaning and sanitation program to minimize cross-contamination risks. And there are different types of cleaning methods, such as clean in place systems, clean out of place, and also manual cleaning. So here on this slide, I will just touch on some methods and equipment for freezing. So there are a few examples of types of freezing systems, both for small and for larger operations. So the type of equipment will depend on the product that you are processing. For example, if it's solid or if it's a liquid product, and also the type of package that you are using. And here I just listed some home freezing equipment. And what I wanted to highlight here is that it's recommended to keep your freezing equipment clean and sanitized, reduce potential microbial contamination. And also it's recommended to keep a thermometer to check the temperature and monitoring this temperature. So I just wanted to briefly touch on another type of food preservation method, which is drying. So drying is another type of food preservation technique that may be used to dry elderberries and elderflowers. So drying can reduce the moisture from food so that bacteria, yeasts, mold cannot grow these types of microbe. So the ability of the microorganism grow will be affected. So they will not be able to multiply in number. So when the food is dry, the goal is to reduce the activity of water activity level to below the minimum required by bacterial pathogens. And I'm going to talk about this in a minute. So these microbes won't be able to grow. Also, this technique removes water, preventing the growth of microorganisms, as I mentioned in the beginning of this presentation, and controls the enzyme activity. So I just wanted to show here on this slide the water activity scale for some common food. So fresh fruits and vegetables and meat, they have water activity very close to 1. So it means that most microbes can grow and there are high rates of enzymatic reactions. This is why this type of products, they can spoil so quickly. So other types of products such as sausage, soy sauce, and peanut butter, they have water activity very close to 0.7 because they have high levels of salt and sugar. And here you can see a water activity of 0.85. So this is the threshold, is the line dividing between high water activity and low water activity foods. So this is because the pathogens, they will be inhibited by a water activity below this point. So what does it mean? Pathogens, they can survive in low activity water, but they will not increase in numbers. And there are several ways to reduce the water activity, and the drying technique is one of them. So the dry fruits also have been associated with foodborne outbreaks. And for fruits and flowers, microbial contaminants, they are usually introduced during production and post-harvest activities. And low water foods, such as dry products, they are often consumed as they are. So they don't have a future Q step. So after the drying process, some microbes, including pathogens, they may survive this process. So again, it is important to follow food safety best practice during production and processing activities. So when drying food products, the key is to remove moisture as quickly as possible at a temperature that does not affect the sensory characteristics of the food. So if the temperature is too low at the beginning of the process, the microbes may survive and even grow before the food is dry. But on the other hand, if the temperature is too high and the humidity is too low, the food may harden on the surface. So it is important to control the temperature, moisture, and time. They are the main parameters to manage the process for drying foods. And here we have a few types of drying equipment, both for small scale operations and large scale. So also it will depend on the type of product that you are processing. And each of these equipment, they will have their own advantage and advantage. So what is important is to use food grade material because they are easy to clean and sanitize, and always make sure that they are made from food grade material. So here we have a few useful resources. And if you have any questions, you can type your questions on the box and we will answer at the end of the webinar. So with that, I will handle it to Dr. Erin DiCaprio. Thank you.
That's great. Thank you so much, Thais. And I think actually, Erin, if you have something to add, feel free to jump in. But I think next have, okay, great. So yeah, so next we have Jeff Higley from Oshala Farm, and he's gonna speak to us a little bit about some real world practices around elderberry drying and just the herb farm operations in general. So thank you so much.
All right, thank you. Let's see here. Oops, share the screen. Can everybody see that? Okay, wonderful. I'm Jeff Higley from Oshala Farm. My wife, Elise, and I are in the Southern Oregon in the Applegate Valley, and we grow 85 different botanical herbs for the herb industry. So some examples of that, you know, we grow things like burdock root, calendula flower, chamomile flower, echinacea, this is rue. So mostly we grow herbaceous tops, flowers, berries, seeds, and roots for the botanical herb industry, for product makers and manufacturers of a wide variety of things, everything from tea companies to tinctures, body products, nutraceuticals, pet food companies, jams and jellies, the wide gamut of things. We also sell direct online, some garlic here, to home herbalists. We sell online to home herbalists. We also sell, we have a line of value-added products that we sell in grocery outlets throughout the West Coast. And our products are shipped mostly in the United States, but go all over the world. But mostly what we're going to talk about today is how we actually dry things, specifically elderberry. Again, we dry 85 different crops. About 90% of what we sell is dried. So we dry hundreds and hundreds of thousands of pounds of product a year. We've invested a lot in our drying infrastructure over the years. The industry has become much more challenging, was just talked about, with making sure that we're meeting the food safety considerations with this. And as it's been noticed, there's two types of ways, and I loved how she put, you know, there's inhibition, which is really what we're responsible for in the farming side, is drying it or freezing it properly to prevent the increased risk. And our real goal is to meet the specification for that final product maker without them having to go through a kill step or some sort of an activation step, which is sterilization or pasteurization. Sometimes those products do that on their own, but our goal is always to meet those specific requirements in our span of control. So really that comes down to good drying practices for us. So really there's some major considerations when drying. The number one is we want to dry in a dark place. You know, we see a lot of systems where people are drying in greenhouses and things, and it does work, but light will degrade the product and change the color especially, but isn't ideal for drying. Now, temperature is variable. Whether you're drying elderflower or elderberry, we're looking at different temperatures, kind of like Thais had mentioned. It's more about getting dry air over the crop. So what we're trying to do is maximize the amount of dry air over the crop. When we're drying here in Southern Oregon in August and it's 105 degrees and 1% humidity, we need very little additional heat to dry the crop. So in the flower season, our elders are just putting on flower right now. Today's supposed to be 87 degrees out, but then tonight it's going to be chilly. We're going to drop down into the 40s. We're going to have high humidity. So we have a lot of variabilities throughout the day and throughout the drying cycle. But the key is to add enough temperature to make sure that whatever air you're flowing over the crop is dry. And that's a really important factor. When we're drying, typically we have a drying cycle where we actually peak the temperature in the early phases, and we're trying to inhibit that additional growth, right? That is spoilage in the initial part of the drying cycle. And also we're trying to get the product to sweat. So some crops like elderflower are going to be very easy to dry. We don't need to apply a lot of heat because they don't have a lot of moisture really in the crop themselves, whereas a berry is a very challenging crop to dry. So we actually need to apply a little bit more heat in the beginning 4 to upwards of 8 hours of drying cycle to get that crop to start to release the moisture that it's holding. Okay. So typically we're drying most of our crops between 100 and 120 degrees. So not so hot that it's cooking it, but also not so cool that we're allowing dry or moist air to come in. Especially here in Oregon, we can get really moist nights if we're just allowing cold air to come in. We're actually increasing or introducing more moisture to the crop, which can be challenging, especially in the later cycles of the drying. So one of the big keys that I picked up is airflow is really a critical component. And maybe I'll talk about that in the next slide as we look at the different floors or the different type of drying styles, but it's really about getting the right amount of airflow in there. So I'll talk about that in just a second. As far as pests go, of course, we're trying to get clean material into the dryer. And a lot of this is about proper food safety. We just had our FSMA, Food Safety Modernization inspection last week, so it's fresh on our mind. We're inspected by the FDA as well. All these things are part of it. We test each lot that is dried to make sure that we're meeting all of the microbial aspects. Every lot is tested for total plate count, mold, yeast, salmonella, E. coli, and I'm blanking on something there. But basically, we need to meet the specifications that's required. Elderberries can be super tough, especially the blue elder. Cerulean has a lot of natural yeast that surround the berry. So sometimes we'll see elevated yeast in those. If we're drying properly and getting to the proper water activity level, which is really interesting, where we're usually at on the farm scale is our goal is always to get below 12% moisture on all of these crops. So testing your water activity level is not so capable on the average farm. We've invested in a small dehydrating unit that measures the weight before and after a product is completely dried and gives you a moisture content. And our goal is always to get below 12%. That usually means we're somewhere in the 8 to 10% range. Because everything in that lot needs to be below 12%, right? If we have one moldy berry in there, it's the one bad apple ruins the bushel, right? So pests aren't so much of an issue. We do have a lot of pest issues as far as bugs laying eggs inside of berries that are a challenge, and that is usually dealt with in the post processing through ways that we can deal with killing off potential eggs or potential things later in the storage. But the biggest pest issue that we see in the drying process is actually rodents in berries. So most of the crops we dry are not an issue with rodents, but berries, these tasty little morsels in there, seem to call out rodents. So that's definitely something you want to have your drying facility in a spot where it could be rodent proof, and then adding extra methods to ensure that your crop is not getting damaged by rodents. The other big thing here is drying time and the relationship to mold, yeast, and total plate count, or total aerobic count, is really we see mold and yeast especially start to rise after 48 to 72 hours after harvest. So our goal is to get from the harvest to the dryer within 15 to 20 minutes, 30 minutes maximum. The faster we get in there, the better. We want to get it out of that field heat, start to get into this drying process. But then what we're seeing is really, if we can get that crop dry within 48 to 72 hours, typically we can hold the mold and yeast at the levels we see at harvest time. Okay, if the drying goes beyond that, we start to see those mold and yeast numbers start to rise because of inefficient drying. So flowers, it's not really a big challenge, but when we come into dealing with berries, we really got to apply a lot of air. So types of dryers, old school hanging, but what we're really going to talk about today is racks and cabinet dryers, small bin dryer systems, and larger bin dryers. So I think the most accessible for the beginning grower is these kind of cabinet rack dryers. This is red clover blossom being dried. We dry a lot of flowers in small lots in units like this. You notice it's basically a cabinet that we can close, and we draw hot air up through the crop. Now we have two different types of screens for this. One of them, this is our kind of fatter screen. We also have a stainless steel window screen material, which would be preferable for the berries or the flowers as well, because flowers are very small. You want these things to be cleanable. The thing is, like was mentioned earlier, all of your cleaning surfaces need to be 100% clean prior to loading them. So developing that food safety practice where we're washing with a soap or a cleanser of some material. We're rinsing that, and then we are actually adding a sanitizer. We use Sanidate or some other form of sanitizer, allowing that to dry naturally before we put anything in it to ensure that we are free of things. Using materials such as stainless steel in all of this would definitely help. Wood is not, it's not highly desirable, but it's not a bad surface either, as long as you're dealing with it correctly. Here it is with calendula flowers. Unfortunately, if I knew I was teaching this last year, I would have taken some elder pictures, but it is what it is. One of the notes I think that's really important is we do as little handling of the product as possible before it's dried. And the destemming on elderberries is a very challenging step. And when that crop is wet, not only the more that we handle wet product, the higher chance we have of introducing microbials. The more people are touching crops, the more chance that we can put E. coli or some other material on that crop, potentially even with the proper practices in place. And we also, with berries, they are so fragile, the destemming process, a lot of those berries actually end up breaking, and we lose a lot of the material just in that. So we actually dry on the umbel, and then we find it's very easy to destem once the crop is dried, and utilize a number of screens to help with that. So these are our bin dryers. The small dryer is on the right, was our original dryer. We built off a quick Kickstarter. It's been upgraded several times since. And then the bigger dryer on our left is actually bigger than this now, but all the same, we have 7 dryer bays now. We can dry, about 150,000 fresh pounds a day out of this facility. This has all been upgraded. This was a pretty old photo. Here's chamomile being dried. This is actually using shade cloth, and we've switched to this to a more food safety or food safe material. This is all stainless steel now, and you'll see some stainless steel floors. But I wanted to kind of give an idea of this is the depth we're usually looking at for flowers and berries, which is just a single layer deep. Now, one of the things that's really important is that you fill the entire dryer. So what happens here is this is the floor. There's a plenum underneath where we apply the hot air, and the hot air is forced up through the crop to force it to dry. The better that we can get the entire surface covered, air is going to go through the path of least resistance. So we want to get that crop really spread out so that the air runs through the crop evenly, and we get a nice even dry. Even with that, we do go in there and have to move some crop around and dry it. So you can see here, calendula flower, the same type of dryer, still the old drying floor. We use boots that are specific for the each bay that are washed and sanitized between each lot, and all the tools are specific for that dryer bay as well. So preventing contamination from one lot to another or one bay to another. But we need to go in there and move that crop around and make sure that it's drying evenly, and that we don't have any air flow pockets where air might be blowing through and over drying one area and allowing another area not to dry properly. This is our larger dryer. You can kind of see the fans on the back blowing hot air up through the concrete, or the concrete block is our plenum. So that's where the hot air comes up underneath. And then you could see the bay door on the side where we load into. We also have conveyors in the back. Stainless steel perforated floors, which all of our dryers have gone to now. We use 3 30-second holes on these floors, which we found the berries will not fall through. It's a good size for drying berries. We do get some fine powders through it, and elderflower will drop some fine powder. We have a concrete floor underneath this that has a surface that we can clean and sanitize. So if there's a crop that potentially might have some dust that we want to save, we can save that material, as long as we treat it as a food safe surface before we deal with that, right? So again, here he is turning. This is a full bay of another crop, but the same concept. We're basically moving hot air up through this crop and getting it to dry. So yeah, there's a picture of echinacea on the farm. And I think that's kind of what I was supposed to talk about. Probably out of time.
Yeah, that's great. That's really nice, Jeff. Thank you so much.
Yeah.
So just for our last segment, and then, we really, after that, want to open it up to Q&A with all the speakers, but wanted to spend some time on labeling. There are some regulatory requirements around this. You have your beautiful products. You've thought all about, the food safety leading up to it. And so now how do you label it? So with that, handing it over to Erin again. Thank you.
Great, thank you. So of course there's standard requirements for our labels. So you have a vision in your head, but then understand that there are certain things that you're going to have to do as part of these labeling regulatory requirements. So there's 2 major labels on any food package, and there are specific requirements for what needs to be contained on each of those 2 major labels. So I'll go through those 2 labels first here. So the principal display panel, or the PDP, this is the front of your food package, if you will. So this label needs to be legible. And so all of the lettering on the label needs to be at least 1/16 of an inch. And those labels need to be in English. So this principal display panel is going to have the product name. It needs to be large enough that consumers can read the product name. It needs to be truthful, so you can't claim your product is something else. So it needs to be a truthful label and in bold type. You also need to have the net quantity of the contents within the package, so both in US units and metric units. So let folks know how much of your product is inside of that container. And then, these 2 at the bottom, they're, if this applies to your product, a perishable, keep refrigerated label. So this would be obviously for a potentially hazardous food that needs to be kept refrigerated for safety reasons. There likely aren't too many of those that you're thinking about, but just keep that in mind if you have a truly refrigerated product that needs to be on the label. And last time we talked about cottage foods, and there are specific requirements for labeling of cottage foods. Probably the most significant difference between that label and the FDA labeling requirements, which is what I'm talking about here, is that those cottage food labels need to contain made in a home kitchen. You wouldn't need a nutritional label, which I'm going to talk about in a minute, but many of these other requirements also apply to cottage food labels. So the next required type of label is the information panel. So everybody's seen these, I'm sure, but this is really the nutritional facts, what ingredients are in the product, and who makes the product, and any allergens if applicable. So there are specific requirements for labeling of nutrition facts in a specific way that that information needs to be conveyed to the consumer. There is a small business exemption to the nutrition facts labeling, because of course, you're not going to know this when you're, product developing, what the nutritional composition of that food would be. You're going to have to send this to an external lab to do that analysis for you. And so there was some recognition that this could be cost prohibitive for very small businesses. So there is a small business exemption to this labeling. We're going to provide you with links to where you can read up more about that. And of course, the filings that go along with that. But just know, if you're a small business, you may not have to have that nutrition label. You're definitely going to have an ingredient list, no matter what size processor you are. And that ingredient list needs to list your ingredients in order by weight. So the ingredient that is the most weighty, the highest ratio in your product is going to be listed first, all the way out to those ingredients that are added in very small quantities to your product. That information panel also has to include the name and address of the responsible firm. So the name of the company, where that company is located. And then there are allergen labeling requirements. So we have 8 major allergens, the big 8 here in the US, that have to show up on food labels. I'll talk about those in just a minute. And also note there are now certain criteria you have to meet if you're going to use gluten-free labeling on your product as well. So your label nutrition facts, there was actually a change to these requirements in 2016, and you can see the comparison of those 2 labels here. Major differences, obviously the size of the calorie percentage in the product is bigger, so it stands out to consumers immediately how many calories are in this product. The sugar labeling has also changed, so total sugars and then added sugars need to be called out. But aside from that, essentially similar information between the 2 labels with those 2 exceptions. And there's a really nice guide from FDA on labeling requirements, examples of labels. And if you're not in a place where you've done any nutritional analysis of your food product, we'll also provide you with a list of some labs where you can send products out for nutrition label testing. We unfortunately don't do any of that through my department at UC Davis. So allergen labels, these are the big 8 allergens that must be on the label. Here in the US, other countries have different allergen labeling requirements. So milk, egg, fish, crustacean, shellfish, tree nuts, peanuts, wheat, and soy have to be on the label. So you can kind of approach that in 2 different ways. So the first here would be you have the common name for the ingredient, flour, for example, and then in parentheses, you call out the specific allergen in that ingredient. So flour, obviously, this is a wheat flour, contains wheat. Wholemeal, so you can include the specific allergen next to the common name in your ingredient list, or you can have this contains portion of your ingredient label that calls out all the specific allergens in your product. I'll also just say that, you've probably seen a lot of products that have may contain peanuts or produced in a facility that also contains tree nuts, whatever it may be. These types of labels, I think some processors put them on there because they're worried that they had some kind of allergen cross contact in their facility, and it's kind of a trying to cover their liabilities in that instance, that maybe someone would an allergy was exposed to that in their product, even though it wasn't on their ingredient label. So this is neither prohibited or encouraged by FDA, but it's very clear that this is not a substitute for allergen control within a food processing facility. So don't think it's a get out of jail free card for processors, because it's not. So next, refrigerated foods. Again, this may not be too applicable for this group, but if you're working with a product that is a potentially hazardous food, and these are foods that are capable of supporting the growth of these pathogenic microorganisms when they're held within what we call kind of this danger zone temperature range, so above refrigerated temperatures, room temperature and above, you could have pathogen growth in these products. These must be refrigerated for safety purposes, and if they are one of these foods, that perishable keep refrigerated language needs to be on the food label. Organic labeling. So if you are not a certified organic product, you cannot label your product as organic. So you can't make an organic claim on that principal display panel or use the USDA organic seal anywhere on your package if you are not a certified organic processor. There is one kind of small exception to that. If you are using some certified organic ingredients in your product, you can list those as organic on your ingredient list and have some claim about the percentage of the ingredients in your product that are organic. But again, if you are not certified organic, you can't use that organic seal or the word organic on your product outside of that ingredient list. There's also other types of words that show up on labels, and there are specific requirements for using some of this language on a product label. So one is nutrient content claims. So these characterize the level of a nutrient in a food if it's authorized by the FDA and made in accordance with their existing regulations. So if you're going to use free, high, low, more, reduced, light on your package, so high in fiber, for example, you need to make sure that you are familiar with these requirements around nutrient content claims, that you understand what the FDA regulations say about utilizing those claims, make sure your product meets those criteria. So yeah, it can get a little bit complicated if you're wanting to use any of these words that have a very defined meaning by FDA on your products. Healthy on food labels is another word that for right now, FDA is utilizing regulatory enforcement discretion when it comes to the word healthy on food packages. So right now, you can utilize healthy definitely in a food product that may not necessarily be low in fat, but has primarily mono or polyunsaturated fats, or a product that has at least 10% of the daily value of potassium or vitamin D. Other claims around healthy, it seems like FDA isn't going to come down hard on some of this for a little while, but just know usually when there's enforcement discretion, they're going to come down with some more specific criteria in the future. So this could potentially change. There's also structure function claims when it comes to dietary supplements, and some of this may also extend to foods. So these are claims about general well-being associated with a nutrient, and claims around certain nutrient deficiencies being associated with a disease. So things like calcium builds strong bones, antioxidants maintain cell integrity. So these types of claims don't need to be pre-approved by FDA, but as a manufacturer, you have to prove that the claim is truthful for all of these structure function claims. So if you're going to use any of these claims, this language on your product, you do have to notify FDA no less than 30 days after you start marketing that particular product, or you can use some of that language and include this disclaimer on your label that, you know, FDA has not evaluated this statement. So kind of two options there if you want to include these structure function claims on a label. Health claims, this is a whole different ballgame. These health claims, they describe a relationship between a food substance and a reduced risk of disease or health condition. These are really the most complicated to use on a label. So really, I just say proceed with caution here. And there's kind of three mechanisms for you know, making these health claims. There are some kind of already approved health claims that can be made for specific food substances and health conditions, and those are available through looking at the Nutrition Labeling and Education Act. Two other mechanisms are going to require you to provide supporting data and filing with FDA, so using authoritative statements or qualified health claims. Authoritative statements, you're going to existing literature, expert analysis, including that in your filing to FDA. Qualified health claims means you as a business are generating this data and you have to petition FDA. I would say that is going to be such a time-intensive, labor-intensive endeavor to do any of those last two options. It's probably not worth the time. So if you want to make a health claim, look and see what's in the Nutrition and Labeling and Education Act and see if there's potential fit there for you. And then there are other things that show up on the label that are not required and there's no regulations. So things like your story, gluten-free, this is an old label. There are now requirements, regulations about using gluten-free on labels, but things like, you know, all natural, vegan, cholesterol, you know, there's many other types of information that you can put on the label that don't have any regulations associated with them. You are, I should mention here, you're not allowed to put ingredients in your ingredient list that are not actual ingredients in your products. You can't put love in your ingredient list, but you could include that in your, you know, your story somewhere on your packaging. Expiration dates, I just want to touch on here. There's very few required by date, but required by law. So date labeling is not a federally regulated thing, except for dairy products and infant formulas. All the other date labeling that's out there is really related to food quality. So the manufacturer puts these date codes on to let the consumer know by what date the product is going to be of its best quality, and beyond that date, that quality may deteriorate. There has been some movement to try and have more standardized date labeling on products to help reduce food waste. A lot of times consumers look at that best by date and think that's an expiration date, that the product's unsafe if they would then eat it and they'll throw it away. That's not the case. So it's, you know, a big push within, you know, food waste reduction movements to try and get some standardized date labeling. A best by or a best if used by system, or freeze by dates, I think is a nice way to approach it, but we're not quite there yet in terms of date labeling. But your consumers will likely want to see some sort of date on your product to know what the shelf life of that product is going to be. So with that, I think we have some time for questions. So I'm going to invite all the panelists to come back.
Thank you, Erin. That's great, really valuable information. And I'm actually gonna, just move us into the Q&A with a question that relates to your topic, the topic we were just on. And so we have someone asking, what's the requirement for the term concentrate? How much water must be extracted before juice can be called concentrate? So I don't know if that's something that you have an answer to.
I don't know that off the top of my head. And so juice has its own set of regulations. It's so complicated when we start getting into regulations. So I think that type of information would be included in the juice HACCP regulations. But I don't know off the top of my head. I can do some digging and we can provide that in the resource list that goes out to the group after today.
That sounds good. Yeah, we will be continuing. We'll share resources and we'll continue to have information, related to this project. Another question that someone is posing: does freeze drying kill pathogens?
No, so freeze drying, kind of like both drying and freezing, it's a process that will ultimately inhibit growth of pathogens, but typically it is not something that's viewed as a validated kill step for pathogens.
And Gary, you answered this in the Q&A, but maybe you could do it in the live session too. Someone was interested in hearing what kind of equipment you use for steam processing of elderberries.
Okay, it's a 3-tiered steam juicer. That holds about 11 quarts or something like that. Pretty much all the same. They got a base that you put water in. They have a middle section. Then you have a screen that goes on top, which the berries go on in there. You steam it about 45 minutes, fill it up another 45 minutes, and then let it set for an hour. That's the process. I think if you can just fill it one time, it goes for an hour. The steam juice. They all have instructions and times to go with it. I mean, everything's time and temperature. So, you just got to figure out what product you're using, because it can be used for plums and apples and all kinds of stuff. But elderberries, I think it's about 60 minutes.
Great, thank you. And a question for you, Jeff. Someone was wondering how you test each lot of product, and if that's done at an outside facility. And that for each lot, that might be a bigger question, but if there's a response to that in just a minute.
Well, when we're testing for micros, we send it out to an outside lab. But if we're testing for moisture content, we have a on-site moisture analyzer. I'd have to look up the exact model number, but basically it's a small little machine that has a little gram scale on it that you put it on there, and then it heats it up and dries it out, and it kind of measures the before and after and can give you a finished weight or a finished moisture content. And industry, most of the herbs, including elderberries and flowers, need to be under 12% moisture. If it's above 12%, it can mold in the bag. It's different than water activity, like Thais was talking about. That would have to be tested at a lab. We wouldn't be able to do that in-house, at least
Great.
in my house.
Great, thank you. And let's see, there was it disappeared. There was a question, Erin, that you wanted to answer, I think.
I cleared it out because I felt Jeff just answered it.
Okay, perfect.
Perfect.
Okay, great. Well, I think we have time for just one more. Let's see. There's sorry. I'm actually thinking that we may have covered all these already. So I'm gonna just thank our panelists, because I'm also noticing that we're at time. And these were great questions. And we will be sending out, as we've said, we'll be sharing resources. We'll be sharing the recordings from these webinars, and we'll be sharing some of the slides. So you'll have all of these, all this material and all of this information to refer back to. We'll also be sending out an evaluation. So we hope that you'll be able to provide us with some feedback. And in the meantime, there's the UC Food Safety .ucdavis.edu website that you can check out. There's tons of resources there. So thank you again for joining us. Thanks to our panelists, and wishing you all a wonderful day.